On September 29, 2012, at the foot of the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, a figure accompanied by a scream fell from a cliff over 40 meters high. At 5:45 p.m., a middle-aged man named Harold called the park dispatch center, stating that his wife, Toni, had fallen off the cliff and was in critical condition. At 6:30 p.m., since no rescue personnel had arrived, Harold called 911 again, sounding increasingly frantic. He said he had performed CPR on his wife, but it had little effect, and she was almost not breathing. He urgently requested the dispatcher to send a rescue helicopter. Harold's voice became more urgent. He mentioned that he had lit a small fire among the rocks, hoping the smoke would be visible to rescuers. After a while, the dispatcher called back, saying that a ranger was in the vicinity and needed to confirm Harold's exact location, but Harold had already lost the connection. At about 7:30 p.m., Harold sent a text message to Toni's brother, saying that he couldn't find her pulse. By this time, Rocky Mountain National Park was pitch dark, and the temperature had dropped to 4 degrees Celsius. A ranger carrying a pack full of medical equipment trudged through the darkness, cautiously making his way down the steep slope towards Harold. After more than half an hour, the ranger finally found Harold at the base of the cliff, pressing on the chest of his wife. The ranger told him to stop and began checking Toni's vital signs. At 8:12 p.m., Toni was pronounced dead. The incident quickly made headlines in several local newspapers. According to reports, the deceased, Toni, came from a wealthy oil family. She was a devout Christian, a loving mother, a gentle wife, and a talented ophthalmologist. Like her husband, she loved sports. Unfortunately, she died in a tragic accident. But the question is, was it really an accident? From the moment the ranger first saw Harold and Toni, he felt something was amiss. In fact, the couple seemed to have done little to prepare for the long trek. First, they chose to set out in the afternoon for a round trip on steep, rocky, and remote terrain, a challenge for any hiker. Considering Harold and Toni were both over 50, such a challenge was exceedingly risky. Additionally, the ranger found that the couple's only source of light was a small keychain flashlight, indicating they had not planned to camp but intended to return before sunset, an almost impossible task. Furthermore, what puzzled the ranger was that when he arrived, he saw Harold hurriedly running to his wife's side to perform chest compressions. According to Harold, he had been trying to revive his wife with CPR all night. As a professional rescuer, the ranger knew Harold was lying because Toni was wearing lipstick, and if he had performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, the lipstick would have inevitably smudged onto his face. However, Harold's face was very clean, and Toni's lipstick was intact. After the night ended, the ranger returned to the scene of the incident. The deceased was still lying on branches and rocks, her disheveled hair stained with blood. Beside her was a purple backpack which contained no flashlight, only an extra pair of boots. Next to the backpack lay a camera. Strangely, the camera was completely undamaged and contained many photos of their trip. In the photos, Harold and his wife Toni appeared very close, seemingly very much in love. But the question is, if their relationship was so good, why didn't Harold seem eager to save his wife? Could it be that this fall from the cliff was part of Harold's murder plan? On October 1, 2012, the authorities visited Harold. He described in detail the meticulously planned celebration for their 12th wedding anniversary. He explained that he wanted a quiet and romantic environment away from the crowd, so he decided to take his wife hiking on the Deer Mountain Trail in the park. A few days earlier, Harold had surprised his wife by taking her to a hotel. The next day, the day of the accident, they drove to the trailhead and began their hike at around 1:30 p.m. They initially planned to make the summit of Deer Mountain their final stop, but because it was too crowded, they changed direction in search of a more romantic spot. At around 3:30 p.m., they reached a rock pile on the mountain and sat there to have lunch for about an hour. They planned to leave at 4:45 p.m. to ensure they could get back in time. The couple planned to attend an anniversary dinner that evening. However, unexpectedly, Toni spotted a fire watch tower through binoculars and a trail leading towards it. So, they walked a bit further and reached a second rock outcrop where they took turns taking photos. Shortly after, while Tony was posing for a photo, Harold suddenly received a text message from their nanny saying their daughter's soccer team had won a game. Harold was very happy and was about to share the news with his wife, but when he looked up, he saw Tony falling off the cliff. Harold quickly ran to the edge of the cliff to check the situation. After anxiously searching for 45 minutes, Harold finally found his wife lying on the rocks. She was unconscious but still alive. He dragged her to a flat area and performed CPR. During the rescue process, Tony's head and shoulders inevitably hit the rocks, leaving bloodstains. Harold, in a state of panic, called for help. He recounted the entire incident in a very calm tone, without shedding a tear or showing any sign of sadness in his eyes. The investigators were stunned for a moment before remembering to ask if his wife had any insurance. Harold nodded, saying there were $1.5 million in insurance money, which would eventually go into a trust fund for their daughter. The investigators then searched Harold's Jeep and found a map in the glove compartment that marked all the campsites and hiking trails in Rocky Mountain National Park. The most puzzling thing was that in the area where Tony fell, a small X was marked with a pink highlighter. Why was that? Faced with this question from the investigators, Harold suddenly became tongue-tied. He explained that he didn't know why the mark was there and hastily dismissed the investigators. Meanwhile, the medical examiner performed an autopsy on Tony. The report indicated that she had more than a dozen fractures all over her body, but her sternum was intact. This indirectly proved that Harold did not perform CPR on his wife because chest compressions usually break the sternum. Additionally, the pathologist noted that Tony was wearing her wedding ring, but the $30,000 diamond was missing. They believed that Tony either fell or was pushed off the cliff, sustaining multiple injuries that led to her death. The manner of death was uncertain, but homicide could not be ruled out. How exactly did Tony die? What happened between her and Harold? How did a couple, seemingly so loving in the eyes of others, such deadly? It is known that Tony was a smart ophthalmologist, successful in her career and affluent. She had her own ophthalmology clinic but was very busy with work. She had previously gone through a failed marriage, which caused her a lot of stress. Despite this, she still longed for marriage, and even more so for a child. Therefore, she began using dating websites to meet potential partners. Soon, she met Harold online. On his profile, Harold claimed to be not only a church deacon, but also a geologist and a successful businessman. He listed his interests as music, movies, and outdoor activities like diving, cycling, and camping. They dated for a few weeks before meeting Tony's parents. Her father, a successful oil and gas entrepreneur, was very impressed with his future son-in-law. Harold appeared polite, humble, and sincere. During the dinner, he briefly discussed his work as a geologist, but subtly emphasized that he preferred being involved in church activities and helping with fundraising. Tony's family was touched by Harold's sincerity. They knew he had lost his wife, but out of respect, they did not probe into this sensitive topic or ask about the cause of his first wife's death. Although they knew little about Harold, they still agreed to set the wedding date 9 months later. According to local tradition, the groom should pay for the wedding dinner. However, Harold handed the bill to Tony's brother, promising to reimburse him later. The man was puzzled. If Harold was as wealthy as he talked, why didn't he pay the bill himself? Nonetheless, wanting to make his sister happy, he paid for the dinner. Of course, Harold never reimbursed Tony's brother. On September 30th, 2000, Tony and Harold had a grand southern wedding in Mississippi. Throughout the event, Harold exhibited an unprecedented level of control, attempting to manage the entire pace of the wedding. After getting married, the couple went to Denver because Harold claimed to be a very wealthy man with a thriving business there. In 2002, Tony left her hometown for good and moved into a new house in an upscale neighborhood in Denver with Harold. 3 years later, she gave birth to their daughter, and the family of 3 lived a simple yet happy life until 2012, when Tony fell off the cliff and died. It was only then that Tony's parents realized they knew nothing about their son-in-law Harold's business. In fact, they had never met any of Harold's colleagues or clients. They vaguely remembered Tony mentioning once that she was the primary breadwinner in the family, as Harold hardly contributed financially. At the time, they thought Harold was going through a rough patch in his business, so they sent their daughter some checks. But now, looking back, they questioned whether Harold was really the successful businessman he claimed to be. Of course, he wasn't. According to police investigations, Harold had no work history and had never earned a penny. All his expenses were covered by the over $600,000 compensation he received after his first wife's death. Furthermore, Tony's family reported that Harold was highly controlling. He deliberately prevented Tony from contacting her family. Whenever they called to speak with her, Harold would make excuses, saying Tony was busy, or he would make her put the phone on speaker while she listened in. Tony occasionally argued with Harold, but he threatened her, saying, "If you dare to complain to your parents, I'll divorce you." Tony couldn't imagine enduring the pain of another failed marriage, so she had to endure Harold's behavior repeatedly. But he seemed relentless in his control over Tony. It's worth noting that Tony had experienced a strange incident just before her fatal fall. On May 28, 2011, while they were on vacation, Harold suddenly called Tony out of the cabin. As she was about to go, she noticed something had fallen on the deck and bent down to look. At that moment, a large piece of wood fell and struck her neck, causing her to collapse and become paralyzed. Fortunately, an ambulance arrived in time to take Tony to the hospital for treatment. Tony was terrified. She realized that if she hadn't bent down, the wood would have hit her head. She shared this incident with her mother, who was deeply concerned and urged Tony to hire a private investigator to look into Harold. But Tony refused. She trusted Harold deeply, believing, "He is my husband. I must trust him unconditionally." Tony's mother later told the police that when she learned her daughter had fallen off a cliff, she immediately suspected Harold. She explained that Tony had been an outstanding all-around athlete during her school years, but she had severely injured her knee in a sports competition and had undergone 2 surgeries. If Harold truly loved Tony, he would have been aware of her physical limitations and taken greater care of her. How could he not know his wife had knee problems and couldn't walk long distances? At the funeral, Harold changed his story, claiming that Tony had accidentally fallen while taking pictures of wild turkeys. Many noticed that he appeared upset and stressed after the funeral. However, according to friends of both Harold and Tony, most of Harold's anxiety stemmed from the police investigation into Tony's death. His worries were justified. Throughout October, the police interviewed Tony's family and friends. One friend mentioned that he was very controlling and resistant to Tony interacting with others alone. Whenever she went out, he would follow her like an annoying fly. For Tony, the only respite was when Harold occasionally went on so-called business trips to unknown destinations. Additionally, the police discovered that Tony's insurance payout was not the $1.5 million Harold claimed. In fact, Tony had multiple policies, all of which named trust funds controlled by Harold as beneficiaries, totaling nearly $4.7 million. But if Harold's motive for murder was money, then Tony was clearly more valuable alive. Her family's oil business was highly profitable, and her inheritance would be worth much more than a few $1,000,000. Regarding this, a friend of Tony's mentioned that about a year before the incident, during a gathering, Tony appeared very tired and in poor spirits. It was evident that her marriage was unhappy. She confided in friends that her husband, Harold, was obsessed with controlling the family's finances. Their conversations revolved around money, leaving nothing else to talk about. The husband tightly controlled all of Tony's money, spending his days meticulously managing accounts and treating her as if she were invisible. His focus was always on money and their daughter. At one point, Tony's father noticed something unusual. Tony had some shares in the family business, generating monthly dividends ranging from $2,000 to $24,000, paid annually to her. 18 months before the incident, Tony received $320,000 from a lawsuit related to a travel incident. However, Tony's father discovered that all this money had been in Harold's account. He angrily scolded his daughter, questioning why she didn't have her own account, and why she didn't keep her finances separate from her husband's. Following this confrontation, Toni finally opened her own bank account. But as Harold's need for control grew increasingly rampant, Toni was on the verge of a breakdown. The next step might have been a divorce. But Harold would never easily let go of his cash ATM. From Harold's perspective, Toni opening a bank account and saving money indicated her growing independence and potential readiness to leave him. However, if Toni were to die, Harold would directly gain $4.7 million from her insurance policies. In summary, based on the current investigation results, it is highly likely that Toni was murdered. And what's worse, before Toni, Harold had another wife who tragically died in a car accident. But did his first wife really die accidentally? Let's go back to the night of May 6, 1995 at 10:25 p.m. A passing driver noticed a Jeep parked at the intersection of Highway 67 with a man crouched beside it, trying to resuscitate a woman lying on the ground. The man was Harold. The woman on the ground was his first wife, Lynn. Upon Harold's request, the passing driver called emergency services. The police quickly confirmed Lynn's death. According to Harold, while driving, he noticed a flat tire halfway through the journey. He used 3 jacks to lift the car and change the tire. As he was removing the flat tire and placing it on the car, he suddenly heard his wife scream. Lynn had seen a spare tire roll under the car and leaned over to retrieve it. The car slipped off the jacks and pinned her underneath, causing fatal mechanical asphyxia. Harold tried everything to free his wife and performed CPR. But it was too late. The police investigation at the scene found no apparent anomalies, and the forensic examination confirmed Lynn's death was due to the car slipping and crushing her. Subsequently, the police classified it as an accidental death, with no suspicions linking Harold to Lynn's demise. Their marriage appeared to be blissfully happy, even convincing Lynn's parents that Harold was an innocent, grieving widower. Lynn's death report remained filed away at the police station until 17 years later, when Harold's second wife, Toni, tragically fell to her death. It was then that the police reopened this report. Imagine 2 wives with substantial insurance policies both dying under unusual circumstances in remote areas, with Harold as the sole witness. The suspicion against him was overwhelming. According to insiders, Harold married his first wife in Colorado in September 1982. At the time, Lynn was teaching at a childcare center while Harold was pursuing his master's degree and working part-time as a consultant. While his actual employment remains unclear, it's certain that to outsiders, Lynn and Harold appeared to be the perfect couple. Their only regret was their inability to have children. Lynn adored children and would often play with them during family gatherings. Before the accident, she happily informed her family that she was expecting, believing she would soon have her own child. Unfortunately, tragedy struck too soon. At Lynn's funeral, family members from across the country gathered around Harold, offering comfort and support. No one suspected Harold due to the genuine grief he displayed. Lynn's father even held his hand as they sat together on a bench. Many years later, Lynn's sisters recalled that she was a very cautious person who would never crawl under a Jeep supported by jacks to retrieve a screw. It simply wasn't like her. Approximately 4 years after Lynn's death, Harold began dating again. Lynn's family fully supported him in his endeavors. Hoping he would meet the next beloved person, Lynn's family sincerely blessed Harold when he married Toni. Go and find your happiness. In 2009, Lynn's sister-in-law, Grace, separated from her husband due to financial difficulties. Harold generously mailed her hundreds of dollars and encouraged her to move with her children to Colorado. Grace was deeply moved and embraced Harold like a brother. She confided her worries about her daughter to Harold. Harold then introduced an insurance broker to Grace. Trusting Harold completely, Grace disclosed all her personal information, including her social security number, salary, and savings. She signed documents without reading them. In the following days, Harold continued financially assisting Grace, lending her $600 monthly and sending her daughter to a Christian acting school. While grateful, Grace began feeling uneasy as Harold would sarcastically call her ungrateful if she declined his requests or suggestions. Harold tried to control her life, but Grace soon found a job and canceled the signed policies. One day, 2 police officers knocked on her door, informing her that her policies had never been canceled. Harold had forged her signature and paid the premiums. Most importantly, the $400,000 policy was designated not for Grace's children, but for Harold. She was horrified and finally understood why Harold kept inviting her to stay beside him, because Harold's next murder target could very well be her. In 2013, the police located a new witness in the car accident case. The witness had a very good memory. He told the police that he distinctly remembered Harold claiming after the incident that he didn't know how to change a tire, which was completely different from what he had previously told the police. Investigators recreated the scene where Lynn was crushed by the car. They noticed that the lug nut Lynn intended to pick up was a deformed one that couldn't roll far under the Jeep. In other words, someone must have intentionally thrown the lug nut under there. Subsequently, the police used a similar jack to lift the Jeep and tried to throw various tires into the back seat to see if the vehicle would fall off the jack. The fact was, it absolutely wouldn't. The Jeep didn't budge. The only way the Jeep could have fallen off was if someone walked to the passenger side and forcefully pushed it. Coincidentally, the scene photos showed a clear footprint on the passenger side. At the same time, the police confirmed that Harold had no income at all and that he was purely a fraud. All claims about clients and fundraising activities were lies. The police also tracked Harold's phone and found that during the summer and fall, before his second wife, Toni, fell off the cliff, Harold visited Rocky Mountain National Park 9 times. He was certainly looking for a place to kill Toni during those times. November 6, 2014, Harold, as usual, dropped his daughter off at school and then drove home. As the investigation deepened, Harold began to sense the crisis. He constantly controlled his daughter, trying to erase any memory of her mother from her mind. He trained his young daughter to be overly dependent on him, treating her as his possession and strictly controlling her interactions with the outside world. Naively, he believed that this would gradually clear his daughter's suspicions. But on the morning of October 6, 2014, when Harold returned from school, the police swiftly arrested him. Subsequently, he was charged with first-degree murder for the death of his wife, Toni. He refused to plead guilty. On November 12, 2014, Harold stood in court and entered a plea of not guilty. Meanwhile, on the other side, police pulled up Lynn's file and compiled the latest findings into an 11-page report detailing shortcomings in the original investigation. They noted that Harold was never formally interrogated with a recording, and there was no confrontation about the clear shoe prints on the car and Harold's testimony. The report also failed to mention the contents found on Lynn, did not specify the direction Harold's car was traveling, and the investigators at the time did not thoroughly inspect Harold's car tires or verify if the tire indeed blew out as he claimed. Investigators wanted to know why, if Lynn was under the car looking for a screw, there was no dirt on her hands in the scene photos and no trace of car oil on her body. Why were Harold's hands, who dismantled the tire, also clean? What exactly happened that day? In light of this report, Lynn's death was changed from accidental to undetermined. Her family issued their first public statement, urging the police to conduct a detailed investigation into her death. On January 29, 2015, authorities publicly announced a new round of investigation into Lynn's death. However, due to the case's age, obtaining evidence to prosecute Harold remained a daunting task. On May 11, 2015, 20 years after Lynn was determined to have died accidentally, a hearing was held in court. The prosecution recounted Grace's life insurance policies, Toni's incident with the wooden beam, the cliff incident, and the loopholes in the original investigation to demonstrate Harold's involvement in Lynn's death. However, the defense argued that there were no signs of a struggle at the scene, and emergency responders never considered her injuries to be deliberately caused. Moreover, her insurance policies were confirmed with her own signatures, and there was no evidence proving Harold tampered with them. A few days later, the first court review regarding Lynn's death concluded, with some evidence forever lost in faulty memories. The police also gradually realized that seeking justice for Lynn would not be straightforward. On September 2, 2015, the trial officially began for Harold's murder of his wife, Toni. There was little suspense in the case as the police presented crime scene photos and Toni's body. It recounted Harold's fabrications regarding work and other matters, including his claim of attempting to rescue his wife despite evidence showing her lipstick remained intact. The prosecution argued that Harold provided multiple versions of Toni's cliff fall, at times claiming he was hiding behind her, other times fiddling with a camera or a phone. However, evidence proved these were lies. The camera was nearly undamaged, and Harold intentionally showed photos from it to portray a loving relationship with Toni. Furthermore, at the time of Toni's fall, Harold couldn't have seen the text message from the nanny about their daughter's competition victory, as it arrived at 5:54 p.m. Yet, just 1 minute later, Harold was beside Toni's body, making an emergency call. The police reminded the jury that Harold did not immediately alert authorities from the clifftop. Instead, after witnessing Toni's fall to the base, he leisurely packed his belongings and descended slowly, and only after dragging Toni out from the rock pile did he casually start making the call. When police instructed Harold to perform CPR, Toni likely had been dead for over an hour. Police displayed a scene photo with blood stains on the rocks, indicating severe head trauma when Toni fell, as Harold didn't lift her body but pulled her by her feet or legs, causing her head to strike rocks heavily. Moreover, during his call with the police, Harold mentioned Toni had fallen and might have a concussion. Comparing his concern for his wife's health, Harold seemed more preoccupied with when he could be rescued by the police. He fabricated numerous stories about his wife's death, showing no remorse as he had long planned to kill her. Immediately after the funeral, he swiftly obtained his wife's phone, hacked into her computer, and filed insurance claims. Harold was as cold-blooded and greedy as he had been with his first wife, Lynn, especially evident in the conspicuous cliff markings on the map, proving this was a premeditated slaughter. Around 3 p.m. on September 21, 2015, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict, finding Harold guilty of first-degree murder. On December 8, 2015, Harold was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He subsequently appealed but was denied. He remains incarcerated, likely spending the rest of his life behind bars. It's worth noting that over the years, authorities have attempted to find evidence to prosecute Harold for Lynn's murder, but the plan has yet to succeed due to lack of evidence. In memory of Toni, her parents established a donation fund at the University of Mississippi Medical Center to train future generations of eye doctors. Toni and Harold's only daughter was entrusted to Toni's family for upbringing. She increasingly resembles her mother and has shown an interest in medicine, perhaps following in her mother's footsteps to become a healthcare hero.